Number 1. Camp Counselor. I used to go to this summer camp every summer, back when I was younger. This was in the late 70s and early to mid 80s. That was the peak of the summer camp related horror movies time, but that's not really important. Except, I guess, to let you know that we used to do those campfires and to tell stories by them. This is something that happened during my last time at this particular camp. There was a bit of a strange incident that occurred when I was there, and afterwards my parents didn't want me to ever go back. I'm not going to say where this happened. The camp is still there, though. I just checked out of curiosity. I don't want to get into any issues or trouble with them. I was 14 years old at the time. There were several boy cabins and girl cabins, and generally, one of each would be paired up to do things together. So one night the girl cabin that we were paired up with were out sitting by the campfire and roasting marshmallows. One of the counselors, who was 17 years old, if I remember correctly, decided to ask us if we had any scary stories to tell around the fire. For the life of me, I don't remember that many details of the stories. I do recall that most of the stories were pretty lame, but that was to have been expected. Plus, strangely enough, one or two of the campers tried to rip off famous horror movies in their stories. I didn't think it at the time, but I do looking back, that the reason he did this was actually because he knew the kids would tell really lame stories. So then he could tell his, and it would seem extra scary. All I can really remember about the story that the counselor told us is that it was the typical campfire story. It just so happened to take place at this very camp, so many years ago. It involved a camper who was bullied by older kids at the camp, and he was bullied so much that he eventually got fed up with it and lost his mind. After that, he killed so many of the other campers and counselors before disappearing into the woods. He was never caught, and he lives out there, waiting for campers to come, so we can come and kill them again. While he was telling the story, we heard some weird, creepy noises away from the fire. Some of the younger kids were scared by the noises. The older ones, like me, pretty much figured that it was another counselor trying to scare us. This was pretty typically the way these campfire tales would go. I could tell, looking at the younger kids, that several of them were scared. I might have been mildly scared, but I knew what was going on. So the counselor, after getting to the end of the story, began noticing the sounds coming out from in the woods. Turning back to us, he put on the cheesiest look and asked us if we heard the noises. Of course, most of the younger kids told him that they had. One even asked if he thought it was the camper, who had disappeared so many years ago. The counselor told the kid that it was probably nothing, but he thought that he should go out into the woods to find out what is going on. One of the younger kids asked him not to go, thinking that something bad would be waiting for him out there, but he assured her that he would be all right. So he told me that I was in charge until he got back, and then I got up and crept off into the woods. Now, I hadn't been told anything about a prank. I thought if he had left me in charge, he might have let me in on the joke, but I braced myself for whatever was going to happen anyway. I tried to pay attention to the noises out in the woods, but a lot of the younger kids kept asking me questions about if the counselor was all right. They asked me when he would be coming back, and because I was paying so much attention to them, I couldn't really tell where he might have gone. I was worried that with my guard down, I was going to be as scared as them when he eventually came back. We waited, but there was nothing while we waited. There were no noises that seemed out of place. There were no people that we saw or heard out in the woods. But worst of all, the counselor did not come back. Now, I think just about everyone was beginning to be a bit scared. The younger kids thought the killer camper had gotten him. I still thought we were being set up for an eventual scare. But regardless of what, everyone was a bit apprehensive of something. After more time had passed than I could justify waiting, I began to get worried. I sent one of the 13-year-old campers over to one of the cabins to get another counselor. They came back with Steve, who was 18 and a typical big jock. He was actually the person that I had assumed might have been helping our counselor with his prank. I explained to Steve what had happened. He was not aware of anyone pranking us, so he went and got another counselor and some flashlights. They had me stay with the kids from my group while they went out and searched for our counselor. I took the kids all back to their cabins and told them to lock the doors. I was going to go back to the fire and wait to see when the guys got back. Luckily, the girls' counselor was in her cabin, so she was there to watch the girls. But the boys really didn't want me to leave, and they seemed a lot more scared than the girls were. I didn't know how much time had passed. I didn't have a watch, but I knew that it had been quite a while since our counselor had gone out there. And I heard Steve and the other counselor, whose name I cannot recall, calling out for our guy. And I was really starting to feel scared. Now, after quite a while, I began seeing lights headed in my direction. I was relieved and immediately thought that Steve and the other counselor had found our guy. But when only the two of them emerged from the woods, I felt a weird sort of jolt in my system. They hadn't found him. I went with them to the camp director. He'd already gone to bed, but we had to let him know what had happened. He got in touch with the rangers as I went back to the cabin to tell the boys to try to get some sleep. My counselor did not come back that night. The rangers searched for him. Adults came and formed search parties to look for him. Many people came and searched for him out in the vast woods. No one ever found him. I don't know what happened. The official story was that he was a runaway. He didn't have the happiest home life and had some abusive issues with his parents. Of course, that is not what most of the campers believe, though. Not myself. But they believe that the camper who had disappeared into the woods so long ago came back and had heard the counselor telling his story around the campfire. He lured the counselor out and killed him and hid the body somewhere that could never be found. I don't believe that, but I wish I knew what had happened to him. Number 2. Visitor. One time when I was at summer camp, I had a really terrifying experience. I was 13 years old at the time, if I remember it correctly. I'm not sure how long we had been at the camp at this point, but it was a month-long camping trip. So I'm going to guess it was sometime in the middle of the trip. The cabin that I stayed in was off to the far side of the camp. Right about 50 feet away from the cabin was the fire pit. On some nights we would roast hot dogs or marshmallows or something by the fire. Some people would tell scary stories, but we weren't really allowed to tell anything too scary because some campers were more easily scared than others. When we went to bed that night, we had come in from sitting in the campfire. Our counselor didn't sleep in the cabin with us. There was a separate cabin for both the male and the female counselors. He waited until everyone was laying down in bed, and at the very least, pretending to be asleep, before he left, and I assumed that he was walking to the counselor's cabin. I couldn't sleep, mostly because some of the other boys weren't sleeping, and they were talking or whispering to each other. I think most of the boys drifted off before I did, though. I was on a top bunk, with a window that was out looking over toward the fire. As I laid there, not being able to sleep, I watched the fire burn. After a little while, I was surprised to see someone walk up from what looked like the river. I watched as he walked up to the fire and then sat down by the fire. At first I assumed it was one of the counselors, but it would have made no sense that they were coming from that direction. But I still didn't think anything unusual was going on. After another little while, I saw another person walk up to the fire. This person was coming from the camp, and they walked up to the fire and didn't sit down. I was wondering what was going on there. It didn't take long until I watched the first guy get up on his feet. He approached the second guy, and I watched the second guy back off a little bit. But it only took a moment or two before I noticed a struggle break out among the two guys. It was not easy to make them out at all, just shadows up against the fire, but they were definitely fighting. I had no idea what to do or even if I should do anything. But then I heard one of the guys calling out the specific names of one of the counselors. It was only a few moments before a couple of other guys ran into the picture, and it was an obvious struggle. I don't know why I did it, but I got up, jumped off my bunk, and I ran outside. There were at least 3 counselors over there, and I doubt anyone needed me, but I had watched the whole thing unfold. I wanted to see it closer at hand. Well, just when I got close enough to make the people out, that's when the worst thing happened. The man who had been sitting by the fire had a knife, and I watched him as he stabbed one of the 3 counselors. I stopped in my tracks, wasting no time turning around, and then I ran back to the counselor's cabin. There were some other counselors in there, and I told them that one of them just got stabbed by someone down at the fire. They told me to remain in the cabin as they went down there to check it out. I did. I was way too terrified to go back out a second time. So I just waited and waited, scared to death about what was going on. Finally, after what seemed like forever, a few of the counselors came back to the cabin. They had come with a police officer. We weren't that far from civilization that it wouldn't have made sense that they could get there so quickly. I had to talk to the officer and tell him about what I saw. They asked if I could describe anything about the man who had done the stabbing, but I never got a really good look at him. Apparently some hermit had been out in a canoe or something. He was the one that had come up to the fire. I guess the counselor had gone out to see what was going on, and the hermit attacked him. After the stabbing, the hermit had gotten back out in his canoe and left, while the other counselors tried to help the wounded one. It was scary, especially thinking about the hermit still being at large. I actually wondered if they would close down the camp because of it. You know, like people suggest in horror movies, but no one ever listens. However, nothing like that happened. No one figured the guy was any sort of real danger because it was unlikely he would come back to the camp for fear of being caught. So we finished up the last couple of weeks of camp with no further incident. I am unaware of whether the hermit was ever caught. If he was, we were never told about it. It added to the scary atmosphere of the camp, and being out there by the fire. But nothing happened, and when camp was over, we just went home. I have never heard anything else about what had happened. Number 3. Swimming. I have been going to summer camp every year, as far back as I can remember. When I was 16, I stopped being just a camper and became a counselor. It was pretty cool to not only be responsible for a bunch of kids, but it was nice to be able to bend the rules a whole lot easier too. When I was 18, right after graduating high school, I went to what I assumed would be my last time at camp. I was going off to college in the fall, and I just thought this meant that this part of my life would be left behind me. I knew most of the other counselors, as they had been going to the camp as long as I had been. Plenty of them were going off to college as well. So, we tried to have as much fun a time that summer as we could, seeing how it may be the last time we had to do it. One night, about a week into the camp, we had done a hot dog roast by the campfire. Then, after putting all the younger kids to bed, all the counselors went back to the fire to hang out. One of the guys had gotten us some beer, so we kept by the fire, drinking beer, and talking and telling each other scary stories as well. Of course, back then, it didn't take very much beer to get us buzzed. We were only 18 years old. And after hanging out by the fire sometime after midnight, the bunch of us decided to go skinny dipping in the lake. It was a dumb, very dumb idea, I know, but when you're young and buzzed like that, you tend to make stupid decisions. And of course, horny 18-year-olds tend to like to go skinny dipping. so we all went down to a certain part of the lake. We wanted to make sure that we were far enough away from the camp that if a kid had gotten up, they wouldn't come upon a bunch of naked 18-year-olds in the water. I was super buzzed at the time, so everything I'm going to share has to be seen through that lens. We were playing around, just having a nice time, and there was a rock that wasn't too high, but it overlooked the water, and we took turns jumping off it into the water. Now, on about the third time that I jumped off the rock, the strangest thing happened. I jumped off, went down deep into the water. However, on the way up, I felt two things. Something seemed like it grabbed my leg, and I stopped going upward. I looked down into the water, but that was pretty pointless. Even with my eyes a little bit adjusted to the dark, I couldn't see anything in the dark water. But although I couldn't see what was holding my leg, it was clearly keeping me from resurfacing. It only took mere moments before I began to struggle and panic a little bit. I kept flailing my arms. I kicked my legs as best I could. I hadn't intended on being underwater very long, so I didn't have any breath saved up. So holding my breath became impossible, and I accidentally sucked some water in when I couldn't hold it back anymore. At first it felt really painful. I began struggling more and probably took in some more water, but I couldn't get loose from whatever was holding my leg. After an extremely long moment of terror, everything just went non-existent, and I woke up, confused on the side of the lake. I was spitting out water but unsure of what was happening to me. After that, I remained on the ground, looking over at everyone as I was trying to figure out what had happened. When I began getting my faculties back, I remembered that I must have drowned. Apparently the other counselors were concerned when I didn't resurface, and they came and pulled me out of the water. However, they were very confused about why I didn't resurface. I remembered something grabbed my leg. I told them all about it, but they mostly seemed doubtful. They told me nothing was holding me down when they pulled me out of the lake. They thought that I probably imagined it all when I inhaled the water, but I know that I didn't. Something had grabbed me under the water. I have no idea what it was, but I remember it very clearly. I am a great diver and swimmer, and there was no reason I would have just not resurfaced, unless something was holding me down there. To this day, people don't believe me when I tell this story. But just to reiterate, it did happen. I never went swimming in that lake again, and I never found out what it was. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.